What if the kings who built the first sprawling cities of ancient Sumer, and some among those who helped them, were no ordinary beings at all, but something else entirely, vessels of a carefully managed genetic lineage, carrying a divine inheritance from the old world into the new, chosen not by accident or conquest, but by the deliberate hand of the gods themselves. These are the bloodlines that have long since been forgotten by most of the world, but were never left to chance, bloodlines that were carefully watched, traced, cultivated across centuries with a precision that feels almost clinical when you stop to really look at the remnants they left behind. Because here's the thing, this isn't an idea buried in fringe theory or hidden in some obscure corner of someone's basement. At the core of it, we find hard evidence written directly into the oldest historical records humanity has ever produced, the first written records known to mankind, pressed into earthen hard rectangular tablets, using nothing more than clay and water and the curing hot rays of the Mesopotamian sun, carefully catalogued in long, neat rows and stored in cool temple chambers by the very civilization that first taught the world what it meant to be civilized. That's a strange place to find something this provocative, and it's worth letting it all sink in for a moment, because what we found in those long cuneiform inscriptions isn't a loose interpretation or a careless reading of ambiguous symbols. It's a statement, a clear and repeated declaration that shows up again and again across nearly every major record the Sumerians left behind. Too embedded in their culture to ignore, and yet too uncomfortable for most conventional scholars to want to examine head-on. The concept hovers just outside the boundaries of mainstream history. Not quite mythology, not quite something we have a clean academic category for, which is precisely what makes it so compelling. So get comfortable and settle in, because what we're going to move through tonight isn't just pure speculation dressed up as proof. In fact, this isn't really meant to prove anything at all, but simply to point out what so many others are not willing to explore our past through the eyes and understanding of our ancestors, to look at the actual documented records of a civilization that believed, with complete sincerity, that the authority to rule the earth had been handed down directly from the heavens above, and that only certain people, a specific, carefully chosen few, were ever meant to carry it. The Sumerians called it Nam Lugal, the supreme authority of kingship, and from the very beginning of their written tradition, they were explicit about where it came from. It did not emerge from military strength alone, or from wealth, or from the will of the people. It descended from heaven. That's the phrase they used, again and again, in texts separated by centuries. The kingship was lowered from the sky by the Anunnaki, the great gods of the Sumerian pantheon, and placed into the hands of specific individuals who were chosen to act as divine surrogates here on earth. This wasn't just a metaphor to them, it was administrative fact. It was the foundational logic of everything their society was built on, and everything that was yet to come. And when you understand that, the social architecture of the pre-flood world starts to come into better focus. There was an enormous gulf between the ordinary population and a far higher caste of divine representatives. Common people were created, according to Mesopotamian theology, to carry the physical and administrative burdens of the earth, to till the soil, maintain the canals, serve the temples. That was the explicit purpose assigned to them. But above them, governing not just politically, but cosmically, stood a line of primeval kings, whose nature the texts describe as fundamentally different, longer lived, set apart, operating as intermediaries between the human world and the divine one, with a mandate that stretched far beyond anything a normal human lifespan could contain. And the physical evidence for this is truly remarkable. But perhaps it is best summed up on a legendary artifact known as the Weld Blundell Prism, a 4-sided clay column covered in cuneiform script. It can still be seen today, housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It contains the Sumerian King's List, and when you read it, the first thing that stops you cold is the sheer scale of the numbers. In the antediluvian era, the time before the Great Flood, the list names only 8 kings, 8 rulers across an era that the text claims stretched across more than 241,000 long years. The shortest reign listed runs to 18,600 years. The longest reaches over 40,000. To the ancients, these weren't viewed as errors or translation problems. They're presented with the same matter-of-fact tone as everything else found in their meticulous documentation, as if the scribes who recorded them found nothing unusual about them at all, suggesting that whatever these early sovereigns were understood to be, they were not ordinary mortals in the way we now know, but something more. And here's what becomes even more interesting when you pull the thread a little further. The Sumerian record doesn't just describe kings with extraordinary lifespans. It describes others beyond even the kings, who occupied a category that ordinary mortals simply had no access to. A select few who were endowed with a status that made them stand out among all the rest. Some who, after a long series of misadventures, even achieved the immortality of the gods themselves, elevated beyond death entirely. Some others who, strangely enough, were intentionally wiped from the history books, their records marked forbidden. And others still, who occupy a space in the crossover between history and mythology, a space that lies somewhere in between, far more tangible, yet still distinctly elevated, but all stemming from a time before the flood, serving the antediluvian kings as counselors, as teachers and priests and princes, and others whose presence was even harder to explain yet. All of them carrying advanced knowledge of ancient astronomy, agriculture, medicine, engineering, and more, ensuring that the sacred arts would survive the shifting tides of time, while occupying a level in the social and spiritual hierarchy that was reserved explicitly for those of a certain designation. And above it all rises one figure in particular, a man known mostly for the dangerous waters he defied, because the flood myth itself isn't simply a story about destruction, it's a story about selection, about one man, described pointedly as a priest of Enki, who was chosen to save all others, who survived the unsurvivable and then accomplished the impossible while the world was rebuilt around him. What was salvaged from those waters wasn't random, it was curated, a carefully preserved continuation of the same divine inheritance that existed before it. But why? What were these lineages created for before the sky turned dark and the waters rose? And if these bloodlines were real enough for the Sumerians to document with such consistency and precision, across thousands of years of administrative records, where exactly did they all go? Perhaps they were never truly erased. Perhaps what we are witnessing is the oldest surviving records of lineages that were not lost, so much as hidden, concealed by people who, across the rise and fall of empires yet to come, chose to keep certain inheritances quiet, lineages that were deliberately obscured from memory, and who may, in ways we have yet to fully understand, still move through the world to this day. If you are listening to this in the quiet of night, let us know where and when you are joining us from, in the comments section below. It is quietly comforting to realize that listeners across distant lands and different time zones are all settling into the same quiet journey through the forgotten echoes of human history. If you enjoy this History for Sleep narrative, consider subscribing to the channel or join the Legends of the Dawn membership for uninterrupted narratives. Your support helps our efforts to keep bringing you these ancient stories each week and continue reaching others who are searching for the same calm place to relax and unwind. So if your eyes feel heavy, let them fall closed slowly, softly, and let everything that defines the space around you gently fall away. The air grows softer, light falls dimmer, and the familiar shapes of the world as you know it begin to blur at the edges, giving way to the warm glow of countless hearth fires flickering in the distance. Packed earth and baked mud bricks from the first great ziggurats rise slowly from the marshy floodplains, their terraced steps catching the last of the luminous beams emanating from the moon. The air smells of reeds and river water, because not so far in the distance the Tigris and Euphrates run wide and dark to the east. The delta stretches on forever in every direction. The southern seas of the Persian Gulf glisten and ebb and flow with the tides. And somewhere at the edge of all of it, something strange is already set in motion. Something that was set in place long before the flood came and did not entirely end, when the waters finally receded. There, drifting through the early morning fog that rises off the damp soil, the great city of Eridu begins to take shape. One of the oldest cities on Earth, a place the Sumerians believed was the very birthplace of organized civilization, the point from which all order first spread outward, across the flat southern plains. And it is here, according to the tablets, that something monumental occurred. This was where kingship first ascended, not gradually, not through any slow accumulation of power, but in a single decisive moment, as if a switch had been thrown somewhere in the heavens above. The Sumerian King List records it with the same calm certainty it uses to record everything else. Kingship was lowered from the sky, and the first man to hold it was Allulim of Eridu, the first sovereign of the antediluvian world, said to have ruled for a staggering 28,800 years. The tablets do not apologize for that number, they offer it plainly. And that plainness, that complete absence of hesitation, is itself worth sitting with for a moment. Because the Sumerians were not describing a man who simply rose through the ranks. They were describing a divine vessel, selected by the hands of the highest Anunnaki gods. A carefully prepared, specific human form, through whom something far larger than any one single individual could flow. Nam Lugal, the divine kingship, was a sacred institution, and when it arrived in Eridu, it arrived not as an abstract idea, but as something almost physical in its weight, and in consequence, something that had to be housed in the right body, carried by the right blood, and maintained by the right rituals, with rigid discipline. The city itself would have been extraordinary to witness. Mud brick towers rising from thick reed beds, the first great temple mounds climbing toward a sky still thick with stars as the day began to brighten. And at the center of all of it, a throne that meant far more than any throne we have a word for today. And watching from somewhere above all of this was the supreme Anunnaki triad, Anu, the sky god and father of the divine order, Enlil, who held authority over wind and storm and the fate of nations, and Enki, lord of the deep freshwater realm called the Apsu, god of wisdom and creation and the careful management of all living things. These three oversaw an intricate structure that was layered and deliberate. Kings at the top of the earthly hierarchy were not selected by any council of ordinary men. They were not chosen by their deeds or by popular will. They were, in the framework the tablets describe, biologically and ritually prepared conduits to the spiritual realms. Specific individuals, whose bloodlines had been curated to serve as living bridges between the celestial council and the mortal world below. It was a system of extraordinary precision, and the kings, for all their divine preparation, would not be expected to carry that weight alone. The gods knew that such a tremendous task required equally tremendous wisdom. Our minds had already been crafted to absorb such knowledge, but without direct intervention, it would take far too long to develop such a vast understanding on its own. And so, they sent the Apkallu, the original 7 sages, who were not just ushered into the world at random, but created directly by the wise water god Enki, specifically to fill the gap. He who was said to have created our own species with the finest clay of the Apsu and the immortal blood of one of their own, had also created the divine emissaries who would guide us through our earliest days. These were beings who were not born of woman nor of earth, but formed directly by Enki's will, using his infinite knowledge of esoteric magic through incantations that have since been lost to time. Creatures that were immortal demigods, described as being semi-divine and fully otherworldly, emerging, according to the ancient descriptions, from the freshwater depths of the Apsu itself, one bright and misty morning, clad in the shimmering skins of enormous sacred fish, their long cloaks catching and holding the light of glistening water droplets still clinging to their scales, shimmering in the warm sun as they stepped forward. You can find them depicted in the great carved stone reliefs of Mesopotamia. Strange figures, half fish, half man, carrying ceremonial buckets and pine cones, standing shoulder to shoulder with the ancient Sumerian kings. And through something called the Uruk list of kings and sages, we can see that each of these 7 beings was paired with a specific sovereign, a dedicated relationship, a chain of transmission meant to echo in eternity. And at the core of both of their missions was the task of delivering the Holy May, the fundamental parameters and blueprints of all civilization itself, containing within it everything anyone could ever possibly need to grow and sustain a truly advanced society. And there, in those deep, resonant voices that were said to echo the patient movement of calm ocean tides, the Apkallu taught the earliest kings and high priests the principles of mathematics, the proportions of sacred architecture, the foundations of medicine and law, and the careful reading of the stars turning silently overhead. They are, genuinely, some of the most mysterious figures in all of Mesopotamian lore, not only because of what they were or how they were portrayed, but because of how long their memory lasted. They surface again and again across the centuries, under different names, appearing in different cultures, carrying the same essential role through traditions around the world. But most people who spend even a little time with Sumerian material already know these figures. The King List is, after all, one of the most widely studied artifacts in all of ancient Mesopotamian history. But here is where it gets genuinely interesting, because beyond the kings and the sages and the gods themselves, the oldest records carry reference to other figures entirely. Figures who hold a distinct and separate designation. Figures who don't follow the usual path, some of whom were remembered with unease, and some of whom they seem to have tried very, very hard to make sure no one would ever remember again. Which brings us to something that even the texts themselves seem reluctant to say out loud, because scattered across various excavation sites in Iraq, tucked into climate-controlled storage rooms in museums most people will never visit, there exists a particular category of artifact, one that carries a designation unlike anything else in the archaeological record. Researchers working through ancient archives in the 18th and 19th centuries kept encountering the same strange instruction pressed in cuneiform script on certain tablets, Nissi Tuppi, translating roughly to the secret of the tablet, not to be shown to the uninitiated. These weren't the kinds of ordinary records we were used to encountering. They weren't administrative lists, or agricultural tallies, or royal proclamations. They were marked as restricted, set apart, reserved only for the eyes of the highest-ranking priests, who by later periods were, themselves, deeply entangled in the political machinery of their own rising empires. Men whose loyalty was owed not just to the gods they served, but to the kings who paid for the temples they served them in, which raises an obvious question: what exactly were they hiding? There is a tablet that most people have never heard of, found in the ruins of the ancient city of Assur, and it sits today in fragmented condition, damaged enough that scholars have spent decades debating how to read it. It's called Kar-4, a bilingual tablet written in both Sumerian and Akkadian, suggesting it was considered important enough to be preserved across two languages and two distinct cultural traditions. And what it describes, much to our amazement, is an entirely separate creation event, one that takes all the way back to our first breath, not the same standard account, not the one most people encounter when they first start reading about Mesopotamian mythology, but something different, something that provides a new perspective that the more familiar records quietly leave out. Kar-4 maintains that humanity was formed from clay and the divine blood of a sacrificed god. That part isn't what's unusual. What is unusual is what comes next. The tablet directly names the first two human creations, the first mortal beings to walk the face of planet Earth. It calls them Uligara and Anagara, and that act of naming in the context of Mesopotamian records carried a far greater weight than most people realize at first. Because the seemingly simple act of naming in these traditions was far more than just an act of identification. It was also a mark of standing, a signal of status, and the general human laborer class, what the early texts called the Lulu, weren't given individual titles like this. They were created as a workforce, a sort of conglomerate that was identified as a whole, rather than any individual part, much like the Igigi, the lesser divine gods we were said to have been created to replace. But Uligara and Anagara were something else entirely, something the scribes felt compelled to distinguish, which suggests, at least to the scholars who have spent enough time with this material, that the ancient record keepers may have been tracking two separate lineages in the world before the flood, one broad and undifferentiated, the other specific, named and apparently guided directly by Enki himself. And then they hid it. Later scribal institutions, working centuries after these original accounts were first composed, appear to have folded these two populations into a single, much simpler story. This distinct lineage was quietly absorbed into the general narrative, the names curiously missing, the distinction erased, and what traces they left behind were marked by the Nissi Tuppi, kept from public access and hidden from sight. And maybe the reasoning behind it isn't so hard to understand, because when you look further back through time, you realize that the gods had already watched the Igigi, their own worker class of lesser deities, rebel and overthrow the order that had been built above them. Now, the humans created to replace them were clearly understood as a species that required guidance not to become unruly. And if ordinary human laborers were already capable of posing that kind of challenge to divine authority, then a lineage imbued with higher power and guided by the most clever of the gods would have certainly represented a far more unsettling threat. one fully capable of overturning the sovereign order that the Anunnaki had worked so hard to put into place. At the end of the day, whether it was the human scribes who buried this knowledge to protect existing power structures, or whether the concealment was directed from something above them entirely, that is a question the tablets don't cleanly answer, and perhaps that ambiguity is the point. But in any case, their attempt to hide our origins did not deter mankind from flourishing. The antediluvian era, that long and almost incomprehensible stretch of time before the flood, was not a quiet age. It was a flourishing one, and the texts trace every step as they spread rapidly across each of the 5 primeval cities of ancient Sumer, each successor carrying the celestial mandate of kingship forward, like a torch passed through generations that spanned far longer than we can easily imagine. From Eridu in the primordial marshes, where fresh water met the salty seas at the edge of the known world, the mandate eventually moved to Bad Tibira, a city of a different character entirely. Where Eridu smelled of river mud and sacred water, Bad Tibira was a place of forges and fields, of copper being worked by firelight, grain being measured in temple storerooms, and the hum of organized labor filling streets that stretched to the horizon. After Bad Tibira came Larak, quieter, but no less ancient, a city shaded by groves of date palms and threaded through with irrigation canals that turned the surrounding land impossibly green. And then, from there, the mandate reached Sippar, the solar city, a place that fell under the domain of Shamash, otherwise known as Utu, the sun god whose light was understood not just as life-giving warmth, but as truth itself. These were not the humble settlements of a society struggling to find their footing in the dark. They were capitals, in the fullest sense of the word, places where kings whose reigns lasted tens of thousands of years maintained what the tablets describe as a perfect cosmic alignment, a carefully sustained harmony between the divine order above and the human world below. But it is in Sippar, specifically, where something else begins to emerge, something that the tablets treat as an elevated class unto itself. Not the king, and not one of the original 7 Apkallu sages, those mysterious fish-cloaked figures who had carried divine knowledge up from the deep, but from another lineage, one defined by this city in particular, because here came a third kind of elevated being, scribes and seers of the highest possible order, dedicated priests the Sumerians called the Baru. Now make no mistake, revered scribes were not a new concept to the old world, even at this point. But here the Baru stand out with particular distinction, second only to the king and the sages themselves. And what set them apart was not just rank, it was the nature of what they knew, and how they had come to know it. Because according to the traditions, the 7th king of the Sippar, King Enmeduranki, had been directly chosen to ascend from his throne, rising up into the heavens alongside his Apkallu companion named Utu Abzu, the last of the original 7 sages to ever be seen before the flood. And there, in the luminous assembly hall of the gods, they stood before the presence of the Anunnaki themselves, making direct contact with Shamash of the sun and Adad the storm god. And what those 2 deities gave him wasn't simply a blessing or even protection. It was knowledge, the arts of divination, higher advanced mathematics, the reading of celestial patterns, and the interpretation of omens that most mortals would never be permitted to approach. And when their sovereign lord returned, he gave that same divine knowledge to the Baru priests, who carried the teachings of the gods forward with extraordinary care. Night after night they climbed to the highest temple platforms to read the movements of stars, the omens that lay therein. and divining secret messages hidden in swirling patterns of pure iridescent oils spilled over clear water. This knowledge wasn't second-hand. It hadn't been filtered through generations of human interpretation and speculation. According to the Sumerians, it had come directly from the Anunnaki gods, passed down through Enmedoranki, and preserved by these priests with an almost impossible degree of fidelity. Unlike the administrative roles that would appear in later, post-flood civilizations, the antediluvian Baru weren't looking through the lens of a diluted religion. They were custodians of something the gods themselves had personally handed over, and they functioned at the very edge of what a mortal mind was thought to be capable of holding. Said to enter deep trance-like states of contemplation, operating with unwavering focus as an elite and elevated class, one that was integral in maintaining the kingdom's cosmic balance. An entire group of ancient custodians that stood shoulder by shoulder alongside the long-lived monarchs and immortal fish-cloaked sages of old, patiently and tirelessly keeping everything in its rightful place, and constantly keeping vigil over the turning of the night sky. And together they would take ancient Sumer to heights it had never before experienced. In its final centuries, their world had reached something genuinely remarkable. All of those interlocking systems had built a civilization that functioned with the kind of precision that is genuinely difficult to fully picture from where we stand now. At the center of it all sat Shuruppak, the fifth and last great capital of the antediluvian era, ruled by a king named Ubra-Tutu, and watched over closely by his son, the deeply pious Prince Yusudra. Side by side, they presided over whitewashed temple observatories that rose above groves of emerald palms, and over vast irrigation networks laid out in careful geometric patterns across the floodplains. The granaries were full, the canals ran clean and purposeful. Agricultural yields were, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary, and the divine patronage of the gods, carefully tended and consistently honored, seemed to hold the whole structure upright. It was, in the truest sense the tablets would allow, a golden age. But it was also a system that had begun to strain under the weight of its own success, and that tension is where things start to shift, because the pre-flood world wasn't just growing at a steady rate, not slowly and not quietly. After the teachings of Sippar, mortal humans were multiplying across the Mesopotamian plains at an unprecedented pace. The streets of the great cities were becoming congested. The canals, once carefully maintained, were growing choked. Granaries overflowed. Their resources were still many, but the infrastructure which held it all together was beginning to burst at the seams. Feel the pressure of so many mouths, so many seasons, so many generations pressing against the limits of what the land could hold. And this expansion, this sheer volume of human life and noise, had begun to trouble the high god Enlil, the lord of raging winds and tempest storms, he who had ushered the first breath of air into the world. The clamor of humanity was something that genuinely disturbed him, a rising roar of human activity that never stopped, never paused for rest, a ringing that carried upward and outward all at once, and that Enlil found increasingly intolerable. The population wasn't merely growing, it was, in his estimation, becoming something disorderly, something that threatened the balance the gods had so carefully established. Their restless ambition was creating a clamor capable of shaking the very pillars of heaven. A disturbance, that is, perhaps best illustrated in one particular story, because to better understand what that loss of balance actually looked like at the human level, the tablets offer us something unexpected. Not a king, not a sage or a seer, a man named Tagtug, an artisan and weaver, a man whose story is set not in the crowded plains of late Shuruppak, but in an older and much more pristine place, the sacred land of Dilmun, the Garden of the Gods, a place described in the Sumerian sources as clean and bright and free from all sickness, where the laws of mortality had not yet taken hold. In this particular interpretation of the law, Tagtug lived there quietly, tending the land, working with his hands, dwelling inside a kind of original peace that the later world had clearly already lost, and for a time that was enough. But Tagtug was inherently curious, and that curiosity, unchecked, drove him to do the one thing he had been forbidden from. The gods had warned him, explicitly, to leave the sacred healing plants alone. These plants, often linked in scholarly readings to something like cassia, carried a kind of divine potency that mortal hands were not supposed to disturb. But Tagtug ignored that warning. He picked from them, he ate. And that single act, driven not by malice but by something as ordinary as the simple desire to know what was unknown, changed everything. What followed was swift and severe. The goddess Ninhursag, a figure of profound creative power, turned that power into a curse. And so Tagtug was struck with sickness, not just the ordinary illness of an aging body, but something that cut against his fundamental nature. The pristine state he had inhabited, the long life near to immortality, the balance, the immunity from the kinds of suffering that would later define mortal existence, all of it collapsed. And that collapse, the tablets suggest, was a marker, a warning, a signal of what unchecked human curiosity and overreach could cost, not only to an individual, but to an entire order. That sequence, from a single transgression to Ninhursag's curse, and the shift from original wholeness to fragile mortal life, sits in the tablets as something like a prelude of what was to come. Human overreach had demonstrated its consequences at the individual scale, and now, across the flooding plains of Shuruppak, it was demonstrating them on a civilizational scale. And all the while Enlil was watching, the clamor was growing louder, and the gods were beginning, quietly, to make new plans of their own, because that flawed act of curiosity formed just one part of a continuous sequence of early history, reflecting the restless ambition that ultimately justified Enlil's decision to wipe the earthly slate clean. But not every god agreed with what was coming. Enlil had made his decision, and the assembly had heard it. The floodwaters would fall. The earth would be scoured. Whatever noise humanity had made, whatever restless ambition had accumulated across those long antediluvian reigns, would be silenced beneath the water. Most of the gods accepted this. Enlil's power was undisputed among the council, and so they stepped back. They watched. But Enki, the god of wisdom and of the deep freshwater ocean beneath the earth, the one who had shaped human clay with his own design, would not simply wait to see his brother bring the world unto destruction. He had watched humanity since the very beginning. He understood that we had become a necessary element, and it seems, from the way the tablets read, he seemed to already know exactly whose help he needed to save it. Zusudra was not an ordinary man chosen by accident of timing. He was the son of the last divine king of Shuruppak, and the final ruler listed before the Great Break in the King's List. Before the flood changed everything, his lineage was one that had inherited the most vast wisdom they had ever accumulated before, running back through the chain of antediluvian sovereigns, stretching across tens of thousands of years, and the same divine thread that had been woven into those first kings, those figures who stood somewhere between mortal and immortal, ran through him just the same. But what separated Ziusudra from the people around him was more than blood. It was what he did with his divine inheritance. The tablets describe him as genuinely humble. He listened. Where others had turned inward toward personal whims or earthly comfort, Ziusudra kept his attention directed outward and upward, toward the heavenly frequencies of the gods. He practiced ritual compliance not as obligation, but as something closer to total devotion. He read the cosmic signs that his neighbors walked past without a glance, and saw in them celestial messages, like the silent whispers of a lost tongue, a hidden language that most ordinary men would never know. That made him rare, and so it was he who Enki went to, a man who, by all accounts, preserved in the Eridu Genesis, valued the continuation of life and of knowledge above all else, a man sensitive enough to hear his call. So Enki moved carefully. He had sworn alongside the other gods not to warn humanity. The oath was binding, but Enki was also the god of cleverness, and he devised an equally clever solution. He did not technically speak to Ziusudra directly. Instead, he whispered to the wall. The texts describe Enki standing outside the reed chamber where the prince slept, speaking as though he was pressing his words into the material of the wall itself, trusting that a man trained in deep listening would hear what passed through, even when it carried no obvious voice. The message was urgent and specific. Tear down your house. Use the timber. Build a vessel, large and sealed with bitumen, strong enough to carry the seed of all living things across whatever waters are coming. Then, take everything you know, every piece of accumulated wisdom your civilization has gathered, and bury it. Carry it to Separ, the solar city, and place it in the archives under the protection of Shamash, the sun god, so that when the waters recede, the knowledge won't have drowned with everything else. There, he said, it would wait in the dark embrace of the earth until the sun could find it again. And so they did exactly that. The tablets suggest a period of urgent, quiet preparation in the final stretch before the rain, while the wider population continued through their ordinary days. The inner circle of the antediluvian world, the kings and their advisers, the Baru seers, who had spent generations reading omens and celestial patterns. They now all moved through the temple archives with a different purpose. They worked in the Eduba, the house of tablets, rushing to press everything that mattered into wet clay, while gathering and organizing the catalogues they had already long since completed. Precise astronomical measurements, complex mathematical sequences, long records of lineages that traced the divine bloodlines all the way back to their origins, ritual interpretations that had taken centuries to develop. All of it was pressed into earthen tablets by people who understood that the information itself was the inheritance worth protecting, and then it was carefully carried to Sippar and buried, hidden from the flood, left for whoever came after. And while the priests worked in those dark temple rooms, Ziusudra worked outside with his craftsmen. And when the work was done, and the ark was ready, he did not board the vessel alone. He brought his wife. Some texts indicate he even brought his own children. And with them, he brought a guild of master craftsmen, artisans who carried in their hands and their memory the practical knowledge of the pre-flood world, the sacred craft wisdom that the Sumerians called the May, the divine instructions that governed civilization, metalworking, construction, textile production, the management of complex systems, and more. These were not random survivors. They were selected for what they knew and what they could rebuild. And then came the rain, and it must have been a sight to behold. A large vessel, sealed and heavy, lifting off a disappearing shoreline, a circular arc coated in dark bitumen, rising on waters that had no horizon anymore. The borderlines between the dark, swirling ocean tides and the tempest raining down from above all blurred together. For 7 days and 7 nights the storm raged on, and all the while, inside the flood hero's circular craft was a compressed version of everything the antediluvian world had once been. A bloodline that stretched back to the first kings, the crafts that had built the first cities, and a man who had been directly communicating with the gods since he was a boy. One man, carrying the last pure strains of the pre-flood world safely across the waters, while the old world was systematically erased below, washed clean. But all storms pass, and when the 7th day finally broke, the storm fell silent, not gradually, not with a slow tapering of wind and rain, just silence, arriving all at once, the way silence always feels louder than the thing that came before it. The clouds pulled apart, and through the gaps, the first pale light of a calmer sky began to wash down over a world that had been completely remade. The great ark, heavy and dark with pitch, drifted slowly across what had become a featureless inland sea. No cities, no shorelines, no roads, on fragmented ruins left beneath the surface to anchor any memory of the world that had been there just a week before. And then, somewhere in that stillness, the hull scraped against rock. The ark had come to rest on the craggy, uneven peaks of Mount Nimush. High ground, the only ground there was. Above the flood hero's circular craft, the sky was settling into something deep and quiet, a wash of dark indigo bleeding slowly into the first soft traces of starlight. It was the kind of silence that follows total destruction, and it must have felt, to the man inside, like waking up inside a world that still hadn't decided what it was going to be. What happened next, the tablets tell us, was not immediately dramatic. Works like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Babylonian traditions of Berossus tell of birds that were sent out to test the waters at first. A swallow that returned, a raven that didn't, the slow confirmation measured in small wind beats that somewhere dry land was beginning to emerge again. And when the flood hero finally stepped out of the ark and onto the mountain peak, his first act was not to survey the damage. It was to build an altar, to arrange cedar wood and sweet cane and branches of myrtle, and to set them alight on the highest point of the mountain. The smoke rose straight up into still air, fragrant, thin, unmistakably alive against a sky that had, until recently, held nothing but chaos. It was an offering, an announcement, a signal sent upward to wherever the gods had retreated, while the waters did their work. And soon enough, the gods gathered around that smoke like flies, driven by hunger. They had watched the rain do what it was intended to, and somewhere in that watching, they had grown thin on the absence of human devotion. The sacrifices, the grain offerings, the rituals that fed the gods had all stopped when the last city went under. And now, rising from a mountain peak above a drowned world, came the first fragrant smoke in 7 days. It was one of the quiet arguments Enki used to push back against Enlil's more complete vision of human erasure. People were not just problems to be managed. The gods could not rule and maintain the earth at the same time. They needed stewards. They needed the labor, the ritual, the devotion that only a human civilization could provide. And standing there on that mountain, smelling the cedar smoke rising from the altar, a pillar of dedication built by a man who had survived only because Enki had chosen him to survive, Even Enlil could not argue with the evidence. So slowly he found his anger dissolving into what the texts describe as something closer to awe. He took the flood hero and his wife by the hand. He led them both to kneel on the peak of the mountain, and then, touching their foreheads, he spoke a blessing over them, and breathed into their lungs something the tablets call celestial life. From this moment forward, they would not age, they would not sicken, they would not die as mortals die. They had passed through the flood as humans, but they were rising from it as something else entirely. Two former mortals, elevated by the hand of the god who had ordered the flood in the first place, now declared to be gods themselves. The immortal pair were then carried across the cosmic waters to dwell in permanent rest as the living keepers of everything the antediluvian world had been, to the glorious city of the gods, a city called Dilmun. They were not erased, they were preserved in the most complete sense imaginable. To this day, the name of the flood hero shifts depending on which culture preserved the memory. Zusudra in the oldest Sumerian texts, Atrahasis in the Akkadian version, meaning exceedingly wise, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where a very old man sits at the edge of the world and tells a grieving king that immortality is not what he thinks it is. Different names, different details around the edges, but the same essential figure at the center, a man chosen by a god, preserved through catastrophe and transformed by what he survived. His memory carried forward across thousands of years, through languages that replaced each other, through empires that erased the ones before them, through every retelling that added something and lost something along the way, and yet still holds the familiar shape of the original. The generations that came after him went on to repopulate and rebuild, and somewhere down along the line, through different perspectives from different cultures and religions, we see the figures of his direct descendants arising in history. A family that survived a catastrophe that defined an entire era and left a permanent impression in the ground that we can still see. And through all of them, something of the antediluvian world continued, the knowledge, the bloodlines, the memory of what had existed before the rain. Whatever divine quality the gods had placed into those earliest lineages, it did not simply end at the waterline. Because these were figures that carried forward through Sumer, through Babylon, through every civilization that came after, all while reaching back to something far older, carrying the divine spark of the antediluvian age through the endless currents of time, forming, perhaps, the long-forgotten roots of bloodlines that are still walking among us to this very day. And so the earth recovered, not all at once, but slowly the rivers found their old channels again, the mud dried into cracked pale earth beneath a returning sun. And somewhere in the quiet aftermath of all that had broken and been remade, people began the patient task of living once again. They gathered reeds from the riverbank. They shaped clay with their hands. They laid the first courses of new walls in new places, and placed some right over the old, working without urgency, the way one moves when the storm has already passed, and there is simply the long, unfolding remainder of life waiting ahead. And all that knowledge that had been carried forward was still there, intact, held carefully inside certain minds, and certain lineages, and certain archives, the way a seed holds everything it needs before the conditions are right. And the conditions were becoming right again, the way they always do. What came after was altered, different than what came before, yet still just as striking. The gods may have changed the rules for all of creation, but their influence did not wane, and beneath it all, mankind flourished. Through the ordinary, unremarkable miracle of people simply waking up each morning and choosing to build something, to plant something new, to teach a child the name of a star. The cities that rose in the centuries following the flood did so with equal dedication, and soon enough those first settlements started to grow faster and faster. One dwelling at a time, one season of grain at a time, until one day there was a street where there had once been only a path, a wall where there had been open ground. And in the courtyards of those early settlements, in the long hour before full dark, hearth fires would glow amber and low, casting slow shadows along clay walls that were still warm from the day's heat. The air would settle, the river would move in its constant quiet rhythm, not far off, carrying its cool breath across the flatlands. And above all of it, unchanged and eternal, the stars would appear one by one in the darkening sky, the same stars that earlier eyes had already mapped, and named, and built entire systems of meaning around. Generations from countless ages passing beneath the same fixed points of light, a grandmother showing a child how to find a particular constellation. That child, grown old, doing the same for another small hand, pointing upward into the dark. The knowledge moving forward endlessly, just like the rotating stars overhead. Not through tablets alone, but through the simple unhurried transfer of attention, as though to simply say, "Look there. Do you see it? Do you see what lies beneath?" And with enough patience they did see. They saw how the world kept turning in that slow, reliable way it has always turned. And the people in it kept doing what people have always done, looking up and wondering and carrying what they discovered into the next morning. There is no rush in any of that. There doesn't need to be. The stars are patient. The river is patient. And somewhere beneath the sound of your own breathing, beneath whatever remnants the day has left behind, there is that same unhurried current moving through everything we know, everything we see, and everything we are, carrying us just as it carried them, through the long, still landscape of the night. And there the weight of consciousness grows lighter. The distances between the realms widen, the expanse of the night sky is full, and soft, and very old. For it has been watching over those who slumber for longer than memory can reach. And just like our ancestors before us, we are all held in that same silent comfort, drifting into it slowly, gently, sinking further and further still, into the deep and untroubled space between the turning stars.